Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome. My name is Varun, and I'm joining you from India. I support the Global Landscapes Forum as a learning officer. We're very excited to welcome you to the second session of the Global Landscapes Forum Asia Community in Action Digital Week. This week is all about bold conversations, collective reflection, and reimagining hopeful and just futures where prosperity is rooted in the well-being of all life on Earth. Excuse me. Throughout the week, we'll be asking big questions. What if well-being could flourish within the limits of nature? And what futures can emerge for energy, food, landscapes, and environmental justice when equity is at the center? Today's session focuses on energy transitions across Asia, driven by urgent need to move away from fossil fuels and confront the climate crisis. This conversation invites us to find out how energy innovation intersects with climate justice and social equity, asking not only how quickly we decarbonize, but how justly. We're joined today by two incredible voices from across the region. First, Aishka Najib, a climate justice activist based in the UAE. Aishka is a co-founder of Fridays for Future MAPA, working to strengthen the leadership of frontline communities, currently serves as campaign coordinator and just transition leader at the People's Climate Diplomacy Program, and as MENA regional lead of the Youth Climate Justice Fund. We're also joined by Jitsai Santaputra, an award-winning youth advocate for climate and just energy transitions. Jitsai served as Thailand's lead youth delegate to COP28 and COP29, working closely with the Thai government on national climate priorities. She's a co-founder of the Thailand Youth Climate Council and Youth for Energy Southeast Asia. Thank you for being here with us today, Jitsai and Aishka. Let's jump right into the discussion. The first question I'd like to ask is for both of you, and we can start with you, Aishka. The question would be, from where you stand, what does a just energy transition actually mean in practice? And where do you see the biggest tensions today between fossil fuel development, decarbonizing quickly, and doing so in ways that respect people, land, and dignity? What are the values that should guide us? Over to you.
Thank you so much, Warren, for the introduction and the question. And honestly, that is such a important question to be reflecting on. And I always thought about it in this way as well. If I was to imagine just transition as an emoji, what would it be? And I always think about it as a key because I feel that it is going to give us the opportunity to sort of unlock a new potential and the transformation that we really, really need to address the planetary crisis that we're seeing today. And we know that the transition is already underway. There's many projects happening across the world, but of course, the real question is if that transition is just. And I truly believe that if the transition isn't just fair and feminist, then it will always be bound by limitations, and it will always be leaving someone behind. And if I can give an example for that, is the EU, to take for instance, is in its energy transition plan, especially with some national policies such as the Fit for 55. Where they're hoping to get to 55% emission reduction by 2030. And this EU's green energy transition plan actually has a heavy influence and dependency on resources in the global south. In my region, Southwest Asia and North Africa, if we take countries such as Morocco, Tunisia, etc., there has been many green hydrogen deals made with these countries and EU countries such as Germany. And what we're seeing is that, especially in the Swana region, where we're facing intense amounts of water scarcity, we are having our resources transported in to EU and other global north countries for their energy transition. And honestly, this feels like a remix of colonialism, right? It replicates in the form of green colonialism. And if we are also to look at other unilateral measures such as CBAM or the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, that is also an EU policy, this also is not a fair policy and imposes burden on developing countries. So we can really see that there are several instances of the transition that is currently underway that is not having a justice lens to it. And I think another question that is also important to ask is which economy are we greening, right? Because we always talk about greening the economy, but which economy are we greening? And when we come to that discussion, where I draw the line is that an economy that is funding a genocide, an economy that is built on the extraction of women's labor, an economy that is built on the exploitation of our planetary resources cannot be greened. And this is exactly where we come to the conclusion that just transition should be planned and implemented in a way that it is not perpetuating the same systems of oppression, exploitation, and extraction.
Thanks so much, Aishka. I think really enlightening to hear you answer that question. And what really stood out to me was, I mean, all of it, but in the end, the final comment you made that a just transition can't perpetuate the systems of oppression that we're currently in the middle of. Thank you so much for your reflections there. Jitsai, would you like to share your thoughts?
Yeah, it's so hard to come after Aishka. I think these are really valid, really important points. And I think, she's hit them all in the beginning, so it makes my job easier. And I'll just kind of pick and choose some few examples specifically in the Asia context. As Aisha mentioned, discussion about extraction, just transitions, if not done properly, can exacerbate the issues of extraction, especially pushing those issues far away. A nice example, I'm based in Bangkok, I'm sitting here in my office. We see a lot of discussions about, okay, we want to use more hydropower from our border in Laos. So Thailand and Laos are on this, we share a border, and there's the Mekong River, which there are big hydropower stations along the river. Now, for somebody staying in the cities, in Bangkok, in Ho Chi Minh, all around, we like hydropower. Hydropower is considered clean electricity, where we like that. But what we don't see is that at the locations where this is happening, it is displacing communities, it's displacing people, displacing farmland, and there are people affected. There are, UNESCO heritage sites at risk of being underwater in a few years with the building of new dams, on top of the existing ones. Now, this is a very difficult conversation to have, not just as a country, but as a region, for the ASEAN region or the Southeast Asia region. Like, we share the river, and we also share the produce that comes from the area, but we also share the electricity that is coming out of these power plants. It's good for Thailand, for example. The Laos situation is that the electricity that we are buying from the power plants there, in the hydropower plants, is actually cheaper than our average electricity. So it actually keeps our average prices low. This addresses the pricing affordability for the people, which is good. It is about the green power, which we like, but it is affecting people. I think, this is obviously a simplified picture of what's happening in the three regions, Thailand, Vietnam, and Laos. But this is, we can see these types of events happening across other types of, resources as well. So there's always a winner and a loser. But when we discuss just energy transition, we really need to think about the value that I want to bring, the word that I want to use as a guide is respect. And it's not just respect about, 100,000 people benefiting from clean energy versus the 1,000 people who have to be displaced. There are numbers that can't be valued easily. There's no exact dollar value to what happens when generations of villagers have to essentially move somewhere else, right? So I think these discussions of respect for the people, for the land, and also for future generations is a very hard discussion. I think the concept of just energy transition, stemming from just transition and fairness across generations and, compensation, I think that is important, but how do we embody that through the policies that we have? And it's not just energy policies, right? This cross cuts into agriculture, cross cuts into industry, cross cuts so many different areas, land use, for example. So, this is just kind of like the tip of the iceberg that we discussed. Like this picture about like the Lao hydropower is what's very prominent in Southeast Asia because it's a big factor that affects cost. So we care about that a lot. But I think in a bigger picture, especially for the Asia context, a lot of it within China, between the regions, between China and the border countries as well, we also see this play out, both extraction from coal. We can talk about coal in Indonesia, coal in China, as well as Laos also exports power to China, to the south of China. And we know China is a big power demand there. So, this idea of just energy transition really, at the crux of it is about accessible, affordable, and clean. But how we balance those triangles between periods, between quarters, between years, between generations, that's like the really difficult thing for policymakers as well as youth advocates as myself to really discuss and unpack with people. But yeah, I'll leave that there for now.
Thanks so much, Itzai. I think you've raised really important points, and I think it's so nice to hear kind of grounded answers that take from what's currently happening in our Asian landscapes. So thanks for this brief introduction almost to the wider conversation that we'll have. So I'm gonna dive into the conversation further, and actually from a really nice starting point laid out by you, Jitsai and Aishka. So the first question I'd like to focus on you, Aishka. Renewable energy is often framed as an unquestioned good, kind of like Jitsai was explaining. But lots of projects have displaced communities and they do intensify inequality. Beyond this, climate finance increasingly flows towards energy solution, but often bypasses movements and frontline communities. From a perspective of climate justice, how do we challenge the idea that harm is an acceptable trade-off in the name of green progress? And what would energy finance look like if the funding mechanisms want to shift power instead of reinforcing existing inequalities? Over to you.
Thank you so much for that question, Warren. I think that's really important to reflect upon. And since I work a lot on the intersections of gender and climate, our feminist analysis always requests you to challenge the binary. So from a feminist analysis as well, energy is not just good or bad. It is more nuanced, systemic, and complex in that nature. And I think the questions that guide us from a feminist lens is to really ask energy for whom, by whom, and how is it produced? Whether it is produced just to feed the needs of the global north, like in the case that I explained of green hydrogen, or whether it is disregarding FPIC or free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous peoples, local communities, tribals, etc. And for that, an example in the Swana region is from the village of Al Fas in Tunis, where the pastoralist community was displaced from their feeding grounds to build a huge windmill power plant without any consultation before the project was started or after. And another issue is also that even after such a big power plant was created, the local community that lives on that land shared how they themselves still didn't have energy sovereignty because of a lot of the privatization of the energy sector, and it not actually meeting the needs of the local community. So it's also asking whether it is at the expense of energy sovereignty of communities in the global south or marginalized communities in general. And another thing, issue when it also comes to energy, the green energy transition, is the use of critical minerals, because this is also causing a lot of exploitation and extraction. We can see that in DRC as well. And also to not just the indigenous peoples around, but also a lot of the local communities in terms of child labor and so on. And when we talk about critical minerals specifically, I think it is important to ask who deems these minerals as critical. And I think that's when the truth really comes out. For example, there was a study that was done by Global Justice Now, which found that half of the minerals designated as critical by the UK plays no major role in the green energy transition. Rather, this so-called critical minerals were being used for technology and military advancements. When we come into the specific topic of finance, of course, finance plays a huge role, right? And if we even go back to the history of just transition, it came from the labor movement and the workers' movement, especially the call from the workers to establish the Workers' Super Fund, which was supposed to provide the finance needed for upskilling, reskilling, and the social protection that they needed as they were losing jobs in the current industries. And of course, the finance is also needed for social dialogues and supporting globalized South countries in to allow them to have a just energy transition. And of course, there are such cases of policies to provide finances for the just energy transition. If we take the case of JETPeace, which is the Just Energy Transition Partnerships. But if we are to explore the cases of the JETPeace, for example, in South Africa, we saw that the global north countries provided all of the finances for the just energy transition in the form of loans with heavy interests. And so this is again just finance that is bound by the control of imperial interests of the states in the West, and not necessarily finance that is just to serving the needs of local communities and marginalized countries and people as well. So definitely it is very important to also reflect upon what, if we have, not just if we have finance, but in what forms are these finance being facilitated, especially in terms of the needs of the workers, in terms of social protection, because a lot of the labor rules are also being broken in this transition, with them being pushed into the exteriors, not them being consulted, and also ensuring different sets of social dialogues with workers and local communities where the just energy transition is happening.
Thank you so much, Aishka, for laying out that constellation for us. I think it's so interesting to hear all of the examples, I mean, real world examples of actions being taken without consultation, without care for how it's impacting the community. And I think one thing that really stood out to me, even beyond that, was the comment you made about you know, who determines what minerals are actually useful or actually critical. And you know, that for me kind of makes it clear that there is vested interest in this whole process. And we do need to bring in all stakeholders in our landscapes. We do need to, you know, consult with them. We need to speak with them. We need to find out what's good for everyone. And that's, you know, just one step in the way forward. But speaking of stakeholders, I think let's move on to you, Jitsai. You work closely with government institutions, markets, while also building youth-led movements. Where do you still see limits to what institutional processes are willing or able to address, especially regarding justice in the energy transition? And what would meaningful society engagement look like in shaping the future of Asia's energy systems?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I feel like that's almost a dissertation worth of uh, questions and answers for that. I'll keep it short and light, just to give a flavor of what that looks like. In terms of the first part would be limitations to what institutional processes are willing or able to address. I think that's really important. I do like that GLF has made that distinction between what they can do and what they're willing to do. what we see from my experience, engaged with the Thai government, engaged with the Malaysia government last year, and this year we'll engage with the Philippines government a bit more because they will be the ASEAN chair, which they switch around every year. We see that a lot of the institutional processes, they focus on expertise, and expertise is closely tied to age and seniority. I know this is not only facts in this region, but it is probably the default around the world. Understandably, that means that people in the rooms have been educated in a certain time and period of life. They've been educated on certain technologies that were probably championed, and today, I think a nice way to put it is they haven't learned of all the new technologies and options that are available. And I think that, can cause quite a chasm, a gap between what we as the younger generation, the youth, think are good solutions versus what people in positions of power may think are good solutions. And not having a space to exchange and discuss this beyond just, a few minutes of a keynote speech that brings a young person over to speak, which is in itself important to show that there is representation. But in terms of effective youth engagement, effective intergenerational collaboration, that's not enough anymore. So what I want to see, which should be put into institutional processes, is more advisory boards and also more youth sounding boards, as well as more workshops, work streams that bring on young people. And now young people can also be defined as, people in universities, people studying, but also as young adults up to 35. So I think that gives a good range of representation from a younger generation to counterbalance the average age opinions of the groups that are making decisions. This is not to say that the decisions are being made currently are incorrect inherently or less valued, but it also means that to represent solutions, to represent society, it needs to reflect the people who are in society. So I think, that's like a basic way of saying that we need social inclusion, we need social justice, and we need representation. And it's not just about youth, right? It's also about, rural versus urban. It's about, the able-bodied, the disabled bodies as well. So there's a huge range that needs inclusivity to kind of champion and bring these people into the spaces where decisions are being made, and if not being made, at least being heard, right? We're not expecting that a youth advisory council will change all policies related to energy, but we expect that there are going to be a boost of awareness of new technologies that perhaps work on demand response, new technologies that integrate solar and wind a little bit better, whether that be batteries or other types of storage. So we do see that there are benefits to having young people in the spaces. So I think, that's where meaningful society engagement looks like for me. Is really the first step is to have youth in the spaces. But before we can have young people in those spaces, we need to talk about the foundational, the underlying requirements such as education and access to knowledge and information. What I mean by that is, if a young person's in the room and they say, we want grid stability, somebody else might say, well, what do you know about grid stability? And then it goes back to, oh, the information is not public because it might be tied to national security. There are some levels of information that I do agree must be, national security. It might have to be not transparent, but there are a lot of other information that can be transparent, data sets that can be available for better tracking of, solar irradiations or, wind speeds, for example. So I think there's a lot of things that have to do with access to information itself and then access to education, which allows young people with those access to upskill and have a better understanding. So when they're included at the conversations, when they're included at the decision-making tables, they can make informed, I'd say they will make informed advice and also be part of that constructive discussion. And that will also reduce the power dynamics between people of different ages. So I think that, in essence, I think that's what building youth-led movements are about. It's not just about having a seat, but also having informed decisions, informed ideas to bring to those areas. And that's really what we do at Youth for Energy Southeast Asia. We really champion those spaces. We're building the spaces, but we also upskilling young people to be able to slot into those areas.
Thanks so much, Itzai, for that great answer. It's so interesting to hear about how who is in the room still makes a difference, and how it is still a challenge in many places to get youth a seat at the table beyond being kind of um, a showpiece speaker. But also, it's really interesting to hear the kind of aspect of how data being inaccessible is really making things difficult for communities and on-the-ground movements to have an impact. And I think it's so nice to hear someone say that even science and science publishing needs to be kind of more open, and have more accessibility for all people and not be behind kind of a paywall. But I think we can build on that, Chitsai. My next question is for you. Again, Southeast Asia is deeply interconnected through energy markets, supply chains, and shared ecosystems. How can regional cooperation support a just transition rather than reproducing inequalities between countries, communities, or urban and rural areas? And from your experience, where do these plans most often overlook local realities? Think about land rights, livelihoods, or energy access. And how could our policy processes better account for them?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. Also another dissertation. I think there is a lot of shared resources across the region as well. Southeast Asia, or ASEAN, or Association for Southeast Asian Nations, which is now 11, including East Timor. It is quite a difficult thing to unpack because we do share a lot of resources, both energy and other resources as well. And of course, most of these energy resources, power generation, likely, especially for renewables, is mostly in the rural areas. So that's where a lot of that has to do with the land use and also the legacy of who gets to decide, what is being used, who has the power to take away or to move groups of people, to bring it to connect it to a more current topic. And I'm sure the audience today also has heard a lot about that. If anybody's following Davos 2026, data centers, AI, top of mind, every single panel on every single speaker, whatever their industries are. AI usage in data centers is the one single item, one single topic, one single thing that has increased energy demand so incredibly high and incredibly fast that it's really sending the whole energy industry into like a kind of like a crisis mode, because part of it is about forecasting how much energy demand is needed. And since this kind of like large scale data centers, hyperscalers, I think that's a technical term, they need such high amounts of energy so consistently, which is very different from big factories, which have off days, they have off hours. Data centers are 24/7. And a lot of the premier data centers around the world, like let's say Google, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, they all want clean energy. What we see now in the last few years is for the need of clean energy and needed so high and so stable, they've almost taken away the word clean. They're starting to roll back on their green commitments for the sake of delivering this amount of power or getting to acquire the amount of power that exists. This is a big concern, especially for Southeast Asia, because Thailand, Malaysia, Vietnam, all the countries are kind of vying to be a data center hub. Thailand's announced it, Malaysia's announced it. And, a big part of that is about access to clean electricity and also access to affordable electricity and also water and other resources. So, this is like very, very current topic of the day, which is, energy and AI. Now, where is that overlooked? Who does that overlook? Is it fair that, people who use AI a lot are using, monumentally, multitudes of times of electricity more than, say, an average rural person, like a person who is a farmer on like a farmland, like in the rural parts of Thailand, right? But overall energy demand for the whole country goes up, therefore electricity pricing goes up to accommodate, scarcity. Is that fair for the people? Now, it depends who you ask, right? You ask the ministries they probably say this is good for industry, this is good for GDP. We want data centers to come in. We want to be at the forefront of technological advances. We want clean electricity. Data centers demand clean electricity, therefore we want them here. It makes sense. Thailand is on this pathway. They also made these statements. But like that overlooks, I dare say 80% of the population don't care about AI, are not using ChatGPT to generate videos and photos, answers, for example. So, I think this is the current issue of exacerbating this type of access to things that maybe not everybody needs, but somebody decides everybody needs access to AI, therefore we must bring AI into the country. So, I think this situation is very unique for now, and it will still be, I think, a hot topic for the next 2-3 years. A few years ago, it's about crypto and energy usage was a thing that was on the top of mind. It was the same kind of issue, but now we've moved to AI. That affects energy access, because if the big data centers are sucking all of the power generation, you either have to generate more or you have to reduce demand, right? And and in those questions where it's very urgent and it's very top of mind for politicians, the last thing they're thinking about is how does this affect people? How does this affect, the farmlands? How does this affect, villages and schools that are on the outskirts of these areas that need power? So when everything is rushed, the first thing that is sacrificed, what we see is that it's the people, and that's unfortunate. So it means that if these people are in those spaces, that there's representation of their voices in those, decision-making rooms, then this can be defended in a spot where it's not too late, where the policies are not enacted and then they have to fix it later on. So I think, in that context of like regional cooperation, this demand of AI, because it's going to be used across borders, it needs to be considered the effects of the people across borders as well. So it's not just about like, oh, Thailand thinks this, and then Malaysia thinks that, Vietnam thinks this, China thinks that. But it's like, how do we come to the table and not just plan for how do we build more electricity generation, but it's also thinking about how do we safeguard the needs and also the people who don't need this AI but will be affected. I think that conversation hasn't been brought to the forefront yet, and I want to see more of that come out.
Thanks so much, Itzai. I think for me, the things that stand out really is how, in the current almost craze of following this AI pathway, lots of people really do forget who is actually being impacted by a lot of the infrastructure that's being put in place. And I think this is obviously, as you mentioned, not just an AI related issue. This is kind of a systemic issue that cuts across a lot of economic driven or technological driven innovation, or whatever we'd like to call it, where the people who are perhaps, the most at risk are always the ones who are not even considered in the conversation. So thank you so much for that, and for shedding light on this. Aishka, over to you. We've talked about the grassroots, we've talked about people on the ground. You work at the intersection of grassroots movements and climate diplomacy. Energy transitions are rarely discussed through a gender lens, despite the profound impacts that they can have on care work, labor, and safety. Where do you see the tensions between these spaces, and how can frontline demands reshape high-level negotiations rather than being diluted by them? How do you think centering gender justice can change what we prioritize in energy policy and investment?
Thank you so much for that question. And it is so true that the gender lens is quite often absent from a lot of these important conversations we have. As I mentioned previously as well, bringing in a feminist lens into the energy transition conversation also allows us to go beyond the binary of good or bad energy and to question the nuances behind how energy is produced, who is it produced for and how is it produced. And I believe that we also need a gender just transition because that is what will allow for more systemic transformation. And this begins by recognizing that the same systems that proliferate violence on the planets are also the same systems inflicting violence upon women's bodies. Um, and that is the conclusion that allows us to also understand that in terms of like extraction, exploitation, and oppression that is being reformulated through this so-called green energy transition needs to be addressed as well. And you also briefly mentioned about labor and care work. This is so, so important to the conversation too, because when we, in the context of just transition in general and also just energy transition in particular, we talk a lot about labor, right? But whose labor are we even accounting for when we talk about labor rights? And often at times, the labor that is carried by women and gender diverse people is not accounted for and is absent from this conversation, especially the care, precarious, and informal work that largely women around the world carry. So we really cannot move from one extractive economy that is built on the backs of women to another. And we know that care works plays an important role in terms of climate conversations in general because it is care workers who act as buffer systems when climate catastrophes happen. If I can give an example for this case as well is if we take a look at the ASHA workers in India, which I believe is the accredited social health activists. These workers, when in Kerala, one of the states in India, when there was one of the biggest catastrophic floods that happened in 2018, it was these ASHA workers who stepped up in providing a lot of frontline support, whether it was to prevent or spreading of infectious diseases through administering vaccines, whether it was also to provide psychosocial support and also support for sexual and reproductive health for a lot of women. These ASHA workers also are the ones that I believe have been over 500 days of strike in India because they are not getting paid minimum wage. They're not getting social protection, and they're not getting any form of other health services and important necessary services that any workers and laborers need. Some of the demands have been met, but over 500 days of strike, and nobody is even talking about this issue. No media is covering about this issue. And this also goes to show how marginalized women are always pushed out of the conversation and treated as less than. And if we also take a look at the industrial agriculture, because agriculture, food and agriculture industry is also one of the biggest industries that is contributing to a lot of emissions and needs to have a just transition lens in that. If we take a look at agriculture industry as well, there are so many informal workers that are women. They do not have land ownership. They cannot make governance decisions on how they use the land, but still they are the informal workers that is not being accounted for when we talk about the transition of these industries. And another important thing to think about is also how women's leadership is needed when we make decisions around energy. If we go to community levels, it is women that makes decision on how resources are being used at community level, whether that is community groundwater pumps or whether that is community solar panels. It is women that makes decisions at household levels on these resources. But when we come into national or international decision making around energy, women are absent from the table. This is a huge gap to fill because how can you only treat them as beneficiaries when they are the real agents of change? And I believe that a lot of the work that young feminists have been doing in this space is very important to do. And I want to highlight one case in specific. So I also work with the women and gender constituency, especially around this gender and climate nexus and also for a gender just transition. And back in 2023, when the UAE Just Transition Work Program was being adopted, this was finally giving a formal space to negotiate just transition in the entire climate diplomacy and governance space. We pushed very intensively for the recognition of care economy and the care work and informal labor of especially women. And in the beginning, this was obviously met with quite a bit of pushback and also just a lot of, silence from the decision makers. And there were also many people that approached us and said that this is never going to fly. Obviously, the UNFCCC is never going to even address care work. Like, it is not related. But I think we had more and more research from the ground to show up with every single time. And as feminists and young feminists, we continued our advocacy and lobbying for the past few years. And finally, at COP30, for the first time ever, the Just Transition Work Program explicitly addressed care economy, and also the gender action plan that was a huge breakthrough for the gender negotiations as well, also addressed the care economy and a gender just transition. And I believe that these work that feminists have been doing in intergovernmental spaces to make sure that at the end of the day, the decision we're making there actually serves the needs of women on ground is so important. And they need to be supported because they are making a difference in these decision-making spaces, as we saw with the COP30 outcomes on care economy.
Thanks so much, Aishka. I think it's so nice to hear some small wins and some progress being made, but also thank you for centering the conversation back on care work and on labor and making sure that we can have conversations about how women are still being sidelined and despite being decision makers in communities, and how their voices don't often reach the places they need to reach, despite all of the words that are flying around. Maybe I'll put it that way. So thank you for that, and thank you, Jitsai. I just have one last question for both of you, and also to the audience that is joining us online. To everyone watching us, feel free to post your thoughts in the chat box. But for you, Aishka, first, if Asia were to lead not only in deploying clean energy, but in redefining what justice in the energy transition looks like, what would that look like? And what gives you hope that such a transition and transformation is still possible? Over to you.
No, thank you for that question. I also had to take a bit of a moment to reflect on this, like what does give me hope, especially with the current geopolitical situations that we're witnessing today. For me, I'm also one of the youth champions for the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. And it also makes me really proud to say that there are, I believe, 3 to 4 Asian countries that have signed the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. This treaty is really rooted in 3 core pillars, which is just transition, non-proliferation, and a fair phase out. And we're also going to have the first ever conference on phasing out fossil fuels in Colombia this April. And there has been immense amount of advocacy and a lot of work that is being put in by Asian civil society that I feel like is also important to highlight. It's not just the states, it's also a bottom-up approach, and we need to give the credit back to the civil society, the rights holders who holds the duty bearers into account as well. And I'm also very excited to see these Asian countries that have endorsed the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. How will they come and set the scene for the kind of ambition that is needed from the other countries in the region as well. And we also saw a lot of strong leadership coming from several Asian countries at COP30, which got us the breakthrough proposal on a global just transition mechanism. This was also A campaign that was started by civil society, especially also a lot of work done by the feminists in the space. However, it was some of the Asian countries, especially within the G77 and China group, that championed the need for a global just transition mechanism, and that really put in the voice that we're done just sitting and talking about just transition, but it's more important that we moved into implementation and action, and also calling out all of the gaps and inequalities, whether it is in terms of financial institutions, especially the role of IFIs and other developed countries, in terms of technology transfer, capacity building, and also addressing unequal unilateral trade measures in this conversation as well. And all of these breakthrough conversations were championed by them. So it does give me a lot of hope that there are good actors that is working in good faith situations as well. And it is important that we continue to support them. But again, going back to the fact that it's not just the states of the region, but it's also the civil society of the region that has made a lot of monumental effort to make sure that we are, advancing in a way that is protecting the planet for the future generations and the current generations, and not really allowing for the triple planetary crisis to continue as it is. So I want to give a little bit of credit back to the movement as well, because that's where it all begins. Just transition in a whole has always been a grassroots struggle, and it will always be a grassroots struggle. So it's important to address it from that lens.
Thank you so much, Aishka. What about you, Jitsai? What gives you hope, and what would it look like to redefine what justice in the energy transition looks like?
Yeah, to, redefine what justice in energy transition looks like. I'm going to go back to the simple idea that I want every country to have a youth advisory board, whether that be to the prime minister, the ministers, the governors, like at all levels. I don't think there's any harm done to have those type of things set in place, because it also brings, engagement points that are not just we finish the policy, we'll have a public hearing, and some public hearing is just it's just a sham. It's just there because there's requirements that you must have one, but the consideration's already done. Everything's been signed behind the scenes. So I want to see that. That's more like a public and symbolic level. So yeah, justice in energy transition, in any just transition, needs that inclusivity. And I think youth advisory boards, it's simple, it's conceptually simple. You just have to open, applications for that, and then just build on from that. And I think there's lots of great examples. A lot of countries have that, and the UN has that. And what gives me hope such a transformation is still possible. Conferences, discussions like this GLF discussion, Digital Week Asia discussion, this is what gives me hope, because it means that somebody takes time out of their day to listen to us talk about just transitions. If there were no listeners, if there was no interest, there would be no conferences like such as these, whether they're digital, whether they're virtual, or they're like in person. The fact that these are happening regularly and cross-cutting a lot of topics. This is about global landscapes. We're talking about energy. We talk about energy. There's talk about gender. We talk about gender. We talk about land use. So I think the important thing is to see the momentum and not just judge it by where it's at this like a snapshot of, okay, these are the horrible things happening in the world. This is all we can do. But I want to look at the glass full. I don't want to look at the glass empty. And I'm sure everybody who's here listening to us talk about this, fellow panelists, moderators, team, everybody believes that there's still things that we can do. Because if we all gave up, we wouldn't even be bothered listening or having these discussions. So I think we need to celebrate the wins that we can, but be realistic and still be ambitious and move forward, always moving forward. Whether or not it's one step today, 10 steps tomorrow, it's 100 steps next week, but always moving forward, always having the idea of just transition in the back of your mind, and whether or not it be energy specific or not. I think these are concepts that are cross-cutting, and we can all kind of take that idea of inclusivity and justice and fairness and respect for people, for nature, for industries, for businesses, because in all honesty, money moves the world. And we, as much as we don't like that concept, a very capitalist idea of the world, I think that's the current situation. That's what we have to work with, and that's what we have to move forward. So I think that idea that in essence of just energy transition can go with us, but what drives hope is seeing everybody in this room, in this call, listening to us, engaging with the discussions in the chat groups and everything. I think that's what gives me hope.
Thank you so much, Itzai. Thank you to both of you. That was a great way to wrap up the conversation. And as we come to the end of the session, I would just like to take a moment for myself and for everyone listening as well to reflect on the conversation we've had and kind of what's been explored, because I think we've gone from, really important conversations about how even renewable energy, which is kind of framed as this unquestionable good or this necessary thing that has to happen at all costs, is still alienating local communities, and it's pushing people away from their livelihoods, from their land, and from things that have rooted them in their landscapes, all the way to how the systems that are through colonialism and through capitalism continue to drive processes that also alienate people. And that brings it all back to the people on the ground, the local communities, the indigenous people, and the grassroots movements, and how much of an impact they can have and they should have on an energy transition and a just energy transition that includes everyone. A huge thank you to both of you for such powerful insights, for sharing lived experiences and case studies from the ground, and for your grounded leadership. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. Please stay tuned for the next session of the Asia Community in Action Digital Week, where we'll continue shaping collective futures rooted in care, justice, and regeneration. If you'd like to revisit any of the sessions from this week or share them with others, all recordings will be available online through the link in the video description. Thank you.
What do you see behind me? This incredible tree, all the leaf litter, all the grasses and shrubs growing over here. This is not a natural forest. This is a sacred grove that was built by the community many years ago. But before you know why we're pushing for more sacred groves and why this exists in the first place, there's a lot more context you need to know. Hi, my name is Sheikh Imran. I'm the founder of Prakriti and also the Forest Restoration Steward for GLF this year. I'm currently in Wayanad. Wayanad is a district in the southern Indian state of Kerala, which also happens to be situated in the Western Ghats, which is incredibly beautiful, incredibly diverse, and also the 8th highest biodiversity hotspot zone of the world. One of the most unique features of Wayanad is its incredibly unique topography, which ranges between 700 to 2100 meters above sea level, its climatic conditions with abundant rain throughout the year, and with some places also being the wettest spots in southern India, and its incredible species biodiversity. Wayanad is home to some of the most endemic flora and fauna, some of the highest number of flowering plants, mammals, fishes, and other forms of wildlife. Geographically, Wayanad is in a very unique position because it's not just a single unit of forest, but it is multiple forests blending into each other. The wider Pandipur National Reserve, which is situated in Wayanad, connects to the whole of Nilgiri Biosphere Reserve, which is the most significant portion of the Western Ghats and also spans across 3 different states of India. And Wayanad mostly consists of moist deciduous, dry deciduous, and semi-evergreen trees, and it is a lush green paradise throughout the year, and also happens to be the single highest population of Asiatic elephants in this whole region. Another unique aspect of our Wayanad is its continuous landscapes that seamlessly blend into one another. If we look back into the history of Wayanad, centuries ago, when the effects of colonialism started arriving here, we saw large portions of the landscape getting destroyed to accommodate plantations such as teak, tea, rubber, coffee, cocoa. But when this started happening, at the same time, Wayanad has a rich history of homestead conservation, homestead farming. Every household here is home to many native tree species such as jackfruit and a lot more fruits that are locally grown in the households. Wayanad is also home to many indigenous communities that have been living here for centuries. And to these communities, plants also play a significant role in their cultural and religious history. And for that purpose, these communities have been conserving numerous kinds of tree varieties through model forests, such as sacred groves. I'm here standing in one such sacred grove that was built by a community years ago around a temple which is about 4,000 years old. So, such a model provides them with an opportunity to conserve these tree varieties, use the products obtained out of these tree varieties for their daily purposes, and also because they hold cultural and religious significance. Growing up, forests to me only meant one thing: to attract the birds, to make the weather cool, to provide some shade to sit under, and to just produce some beautiful flowers. But now, various different uses. But for communities in Wayanad and across the world that are working on conserving forests,
planting more native trees.
it means protecting nature. As beautiful as Wayanad might look and as thriving as the Western Ghats might be, the reality is we are losing forests at a really alarming rate. If you look into the recent news that has been happening in Wayanad and surrounding areas, is that we are observing a large amount of human wildlife conflict. Deeper into the forest, fragments of plastic and glass in those dung. Further going into the forest, watering holes are drying up, huge presence of invasive species like senna and lantana everywhere. So this just goes to say that there's a large amount of forest fragmentation, improper land management. Communities are directly being impacted. Our project aims to bridge the gap between community needs and conservation efforts. In Wayanad, we're working with communities to not just protect sacred groves, but turn them into conservation hubs for rare, endangered, and threatened tree species. We're building a hub and spoke model with communities to help other stakeholders like the forest department and private afforestation efforts to integrate native and endangered species into their landscapes. The goal is simple: support communities to lead conservation while protecting nature.